A net of wrinkles spread across the turmeric powdered on her face. Her head of snow-white hair shook uncontrollably. Their eyes filled with fear. Dina and his wife stared at the old woman. She seemed to be alive, even though she was most certainly a ghost. At long last, Dina's wife took courage and said, "Aunt, you are still alive?" The old woman did not reply. Dina's wife recalled that she had been hard of hearing. Perhaps the affliction had pursued her in death too. She went closer to the old woman and loudly repeated her question. Understanding flashed in the old woman's eyes, and she said, "Can't you see that I am alive? 7 days I was racked with fever. There was no one to give me even a sip of water. Tulsi had been away for many days. I could have died in his absence. One can go any time. My fever went down today. I hardly had the strength to get up, but somehow I have pushed myself till here. Why are the two of you staring at me so?" Dina and his wife exchanged looks of immense relief. She really was the Brahmin's wife and not a ghost. The fever had saved her from the fate of the rest of the village. Her deafness had prevented her from hearing of the great sorrow that had befallen the village on Thursday night. She hadn't realized that her village was now in Pakistan. She did not know that Pakistan was now in her village. That not one Hindu or Sikh was alive except for a few girls in the hands of the rioters. Suddenly the old woman asked, "Dina, have you seen my goat anywhere?" Goat? Thought Dina. Her goat? In these days when the rioters had cooked and eaten even looted cattle, this old woman was bothered about a goat? "I don't know where she's run off to," the old woman continued, "and she's due. I can't even look after myself now. I can't go looking for her. And how can I catch her anyway? If you see her anywhere, tie her up. God bless you. You know she's due. I hope she doesn't give birth somewhere outside." "Old woman, your goat is not here. She's been eaten up and being digested by now." But the old woman heard nothing. He was about to repeat himself loudly, but a glance from his wife silenced him. "And look at this," the old woman said. "I found this chain near the door of the Thakurdwar. I don't know how this goat managed to loosen the chain. This link where the log goes has been eaten through and through. I thought I'll tell you to fix it for me." For some time, Dina's wife had been staring at the old woman in a strange manner. She seemed to be wrestling with something. And then, as if everything had suddenly become clear, she said, "Aunt, why don't you stay here? You will be alone in the Thakurdwar. And your fever has just abated. Cook your food here. Bring your own utensils, since you are a Hindu. Let Tulsi return, then you can return." The old woman seemed to have grown even more deaf. She only caught Tulsi's name. "I'm telling you, he's gone out of the village. He's gone with Ram Shah's daughter's betrothal party to Navachak. On the 1st of next month, Preeto is to be married. I told Shah to gift me a cow. It's not every day that there are celebrations in the houses of the rich. And you know, Tulsi needs the milk and the curds for his health." Ignoring the old woman's talk, Dina's wife was trying to catch her husband's eye. She wanted to say something, but before she could, Dina was already speaking. "I know what's on your mind, but we can't do it. I have no objection. But where will we hide her? Soon your sons will be here, their nostrils sniffing out human flesh, and we won't be able to conceal her. They will figure it out instantly, and what will they do to us then?" "She's old," beseeched Dina's wife, "the last of our village Hindus, a God-fearing old woman. It's only a matter of a few days. Let her son return, and then we will send her to some village." "Which village will you send her to?" Dina was almost screaming now. "Is there a village left where she will be safe? And her son? He'll never return. This time he has been sent to a place from where there is no return. All the Hindus of Navachak have been killed. Not one of them is left." His wife's face fell. She put a trembling finger to her lips, begging him to lower his tone. Except for Dina's outburst, they'd been talking in whispers, but it was unnecessary, for even their loudest tones would not have reached the old woman through her deafness. She stared at them with her fevered eyes. "Why are you two whispering away about? And Dina, why don't you look at me? Just repair this cursed chain. It's not that I'm asking for much." "Come tomorrow," Dina shouted into the old woman's ears. "I don't have any time today. Go home now." "All right," the woman croaked, putting her hands on her knees to steady herself as she rose. "I'll go. If you say tomorrow, then let it be so, but keep an eye out for my goat. I told you, just tie her up if you see. Wretched thing, God knows where she has run away to." And before Dina's wife could stop her, the old woman had lurched out into the lane. How much time this woman had wasted, Dina fumed. He could have made 5 axes in this much time. And Bashir was not going to listen to any excuses. He would want his 50. But he could not put his heart into his work. Something began to gnaw at his heart. He could not dismiss the vision of fever-ridden eyes and snow-white hair. Those eyes were burning holes in his head like 2 red-hot embers. Most of all, it was ignorance that bothered him. She knew nothing. That Tulsi was never to return. That Preeto was never to get married. That Bashir had already taken Preeto along with a rich father's estate. It was a rotten thing that Bashir had done. Defending the honor of women of the village was a common burden. Everyone's daughters were just like your own. The loss of any woman's honor was a catastrophe for all. That pale, childlike face of Preeto began to swim before his eyes, and her plaintive cries echoed in his ears. He was seized by a shiver, a cold and uncontrollable shiver that seemed a precursor to certain death. The shivering, he felt, could be stopped only if he picked up the red-hot iron from the fire and clasped it against his heart. But why was his head on fire? The entire blazing furnace seemed to have entered his head. He pressed it with both hands and the fire came onto his palms. He was going mad. He would end up doing something terrible. He must run away, far away from all this. He opened the window and jumped out. For a long time he wandered aimlessly in the fields. The afternoon had now become evening. On the horizon someone had murdered the sun. The blood of innocents had spread across the sky and had dissolved into the waters of the streams and canals. Would anybody eat the sugar cane that had been sprayed with blood? Or wear the cotton that had been irrigated by blood? What kind of wheat would grow in this blood-drenched soul? And what kind of a harvest would it be after this bloody season? The shower of blood that had reddened everything had been caused by the axes he had fashioned. The crop of bones and flesh had been sown by spears made by his hands. And he had just finished making axes for the handful of villages that were still left. Those too would be gone by tomorrow night. He was guilty, heavily, deeply guilty. Bashir's mother had been right. At least he should not let them lay their hands on the new axes. Then he started running, like a man possessed, towards the village. He wanted to reach home before Bashir's men. He wanted to throw the axes in some well or canal from there they would never be found. When he reached the village, it was dark. The indifferent light of a hazy moon threw faint shadows onto the lane. The previous night's rain had left a muddy slush everywhere. Again and again his feet caught in the thick slush, but he kept walking quickly through the lanes. Suddenly he stopped. He could hear voices coming from a short distance. In fact, they were coming from his house. Had they already come? Was he too late? He could clearly hear Bashir's vulgar laughter. He stumbled against some heavy object near his house and fell on his face. He tried to get up but couldn't. An icy cold grip had clasped his feet. He tried to free them, but the grip only seemed to get tighter. A terrible fear clutched at his heart and a cold sweat covered his forehead. With a strong jerk, he turned to look back. In the dim moonlight, he saw a thatch of white hair rippling in the wind. The old woman's wrinkled forehead bore a long gash from an axe, and there was a curse in the wide-open, frightened eyes. He looked at his feet. They were caught in the chain that was entangled around her forearms. He screamed once and fainted. That night he was gripped by a high fever. All night he tossed wildly on the bed. All night his delirious shouts echoed in the silence of the village. Don't kill me. Don't kill me with those axes. Get this chain off my neck. Oh, my daughter, don't harm my daughter. Don't harm Preeto. Oh, these chains. In Allah's name, don't use those axes. Don't kill her. Thank you.
Quite a tremendous story. When you first read it in the original Punjabi, what did you think and what did you feel?
Well, it was always a story which brought home the physics and chemistry of all the violence that was happening during partition, really, and it showed that that not everybody was bad. Here, the father was good and the sons were bad. So I thought in many ways it encompassed all the contradictions and all the dilemmas that were existent at that time of crisis for humanity, actually.
Actually, there's a very interesting quality to these stories because a lot of them, they're very unblinking in their depiction of the violence, but a lot of the violence is psychological, as opposed to delving straight into, X did this to Y. They're actually being played out in the minds of the protagonists. So these are really dialogues which the protagonists are having with themselves, which is a very interesting take in itself. I mean, a lot of it reminded me of Mantha's writing, but the big difference that I felt, and I would like to know your opinion, is that where Mantha's writing is absolutely bleak all throughout, there's very little hope at the end of it. These stories have a very interesting, and we'll have one more reading, the quality of hope and optimism, even in such terrible times, the belief that an ordinary person can find in themselves great reserves of courage and compassion for other people. That remains constant in these stories. So that's a very interesting, philosophy to bear through these times. Could you tell us a little bit, perhaps?
Well, I think you put your finger on the real point of these stories, because that was the author's philosophy, that there has to be hope. And I can do no better than quote something from his own writing, which I put in the introduction, because many of the stories are done as satire. So there's a lot of satire, for instance, and satire is usually showing animals against men and showing animal values to be very often better than human values in certain situations. So in that context, he writes, despite all this satire, I am not without hope. Hopelessness leads to death and destruction, and it has never been my intention to put foot on that path. A writer who is without hope has no right to be satiric. I did not lose faith even when faced by the barbarity of partition. My partition stories pass knee-deep through the dark quicksand of blood and crushed bone, but they keep on their head, on which they carry their bundle of hope, clearly above the quicksand. This hope is kept intact even in the whirlwinds of barbarity and brutality. So, I think the ultimate message of the stories was hope, despite the fact that they came through showing the grim violence. And you're right, it's not always physical violence, but the damage that violence does to an entire generation of who passed, and very often, carries on in their minds years later after the physical aspects have subsided. The trauma of going through a riot, the trauma of being hunted out and dragged and killed, and the trauma of hiding and trying to escape for no fault of yours, I think that is a trauma which is not easily forgotten. And it happened to a lot of people, I mean, the entire generation which we called the refugees generation that came from here or went from here to there, survived that and suffered that and carried that burden for late into their lives until, the last days.
And actually it's a very incredible thing because these were the people who went on to make post-independence India. The nation that it has become, which, held on to secularism and held on to the values of equality, despite tremendous stresses and strains. So it's actually a very interesting paradox that you see there. People who have come through the darkest of times, but hold on to these values and, despite several challenges, keep the faith, really.
Because I think that's exactly the point, because I think anybody who saw this, and that's again the point depicted by these stories, it was not that everybody of a particular religion was bad. So I don't see it as a challenge to secular values. It was that, that there were people in every religion. And I mean, this book shows, terrible things happening in Delhi to Muslims at the hands of Sikhs. It shows terrible things happening to Sikhs and Hindus at the hands of Muslims. So in every religion there were bad people, and in every religion you will find in this book there will be somebody who will stand apart from all this and say, no, there is something called humanity, let us defend it.
Actually, there's a very lovely, very short and very lovely story in the book. We'll go to she and I a little later. But
maybe that may be too long for the audience.